Welcome to Understanding Islam, the Big Picture. This is our especially extended week when we're going to have not only the talk for the first part, but after the break we're going to come back for me working with some of the questions that you have emailed in. So our topic for this week is, what's the purpose of religion? Now this is obviously a question that every religious tradition must answer, more especially in our own times when there are lots of people in societies who don't want anything more to do with religion, and they certainly will ask, well, what's the point? So we can begin by answering that question from an Islamic perspective by saying that Islam is a complete way of life that leads human beings to a fully human life during this life and to grow ever closer to God in paradise. So this then is the purpose of Islam. To live a fully human life. There is nothing in Islam that is antibody, that wants us to torture ourselves. Indeed, the excesses of asceticism are not permitted in Islam. Islam is a way of discipline and not of torturing oneself. It's also a way in which we should thrive and flourish as human beings. And so to be happy, to live a fulfilled life, is an important part of the Islamic way. But that doesn't mean that the whole of life is going to be a bed of roses. It doesn't mean that everything is going to go smoothly and sweetly just because people believe in God and follow the guidance. Indeed, this life is a test. It is a test to see how we will react when things go wrong. And one of the principal virtues of Islam is sabr, patience. Things must be patiently borne. Some things cannot be changed. And so this life as a test is a test of our patience, of our discipline, of our commitment. But the Quran tells us that God will not allow human beings to be tested or tried beyond their means to endure. So it must always be a life lived in the knowledge of hope and trust in God. One of the things about being human is that we are stuck in time. Time is always something which is on the move. It never stands still, we say. Now, if you can imagine that you're in an airport and there's one of those moving walkways, but instead of going with the flow of movement, you're trying to go against it. If you stand still, you will go backwards. Now, that's a model of what time and life is like. Time is always coming toward us, and yesterday's commitment is not going to carry us through today. Every day, indeed every minute, we must recommit ourselves to following in the guidance of God, to following along the path or the way of Islam. And so just as we could say, well, I meant my vows on the day of my wedding, but I have never repeated them since, that would lead us to a marriage that was distinctly problematic. So just acknowledging that one is a Muslim and saying, I believe, is not sufficient to carry us through life. Every day in every way, we have to keep on struggling and going forwards. There is a story told in the histories of the life of Prophet Muhammad in the last little while before he died, when he was quite weak and frail. And he was on his way into the mosque for prayers and was being helped along by a couple of men of the community. And somebody came to him and said, "Oh, prophet of God, surely, look at the state of you. You could miss the prayers." And his response was, "No, me too. And to your very last breath, keep on obeying the commandments of God, keep on observing the prohibitions of God. The whole of life is to be a struggle between the hope of the reward of heaven and a fear and knowledge and understanding of the possibility of God's punishment." So the whole of life is one long struggle. Now, Islam does not have a doctrine of original sin, so all human beings are basically good. All human beings have the ability to distinguish right from wrong. But we are naturally forgetful. We have a natural tendency to forget the right and to drift off message. More so than this, there is also the shaitan, the great tempter. And the great tempter, the shaitan, will spend all his time trying to tempt human beings away from the right path. This must be resisted. It is something with which human beings must struggle. So this great struggle to do the right thing and avoid the wrong thing, to commit every minute, every action, every thought in the way of God, is part of the dynamic of being human. In Arabic, we will call this jihad. Jihad means to struggle and strive in the way of God, to keep on going, not to give up, to live a disciplined struggle to follow the commandments of God. Now, in this way, we can see that the practices of Islam help to train human beings in this lifelong struggle. If we take, for example, the routine of prayer, every day is punctuated by 5 regular formal prayers. Early in the morning, in the middle of the day, in the late afternoon, in the evening, and again at night time. You can see this is the natural rhythm of the day, and never more than a few hours goes by before one is brought back to stand again before God, to confess one's sins to God, to seek God's mercy and forgiveness, to hear again the guidance of God in the Quran, and then finally to prostrate and lay the whole of one's being before God and acknowledge God as the only being worthy of worship. Or we can think of the discipline of fasting, when for the whole of the month of Ramadan, 29 or 30 days, Muslims are required to keep a complete daylight fast. This is to teach self-discipline, to give one the strength to resist those temptations. It's to teach us that all our habits can be broken if God so wills, to teach us a dependence upon God. Now, we can see these practices of Islam as being part of this lifelong ongoing jihad. In the same way, we can think of the practical giving of what we have to be used in the way of God, sadaqah. We can translate sadaqah as bearing one another's burdens. We have a wonderful example of Prophet Muhammad, who goes to bed at night with empty pockets. Whatever has been given to him during the day, he has given away by the end of the day. And this attitude of using the things that we have for the well-being of humanity in accordance to the guidance of God permeates the life of a Muslim. So we have, for example, big floods down in Cornwall a few years ago. A Muslim group responded by saying, this is our opportunity to show the people of Cornwall what Islam is really about. There aren't many Muslims who live there, And so they got a lorry, they filled it with all the bottled water that they could find, and then they went down the motorway to distribute that water amongst those who had no clean water to drink because of the flooding. Or I think of another example when a Christian bishop from Africa sent a message asking for help to build a road so as to open up that part of his territory for the people there so that they could make a life for themselves. As soon as the people in the local mosque in London heard about it, they contributed to building that road. Or I think again of a Christian lady who was going to Palestine to help rebuild a house that had been pulled down to make way for the segregation wall that's being built there. As soon as she told her story in a local mosque, the ladies of the mosque were pressing money into her hands. Please, can we help you? Can we help to bear the burdens of those who are in need? I have an African friend, and if I should be so fortunate as to arrive at the time that food is being prepared, he will greet me. You must have a well-trained camel that brings you to my door just at the time that I have the chance to share food with you. And so in this way, our hearts are softened. We are constantly trained and prepared to remember God and to remember to live according to the guidance of God. That's part of our great jihad. Sabr is one principal virtue of Islam, and another is taqwa. We can translate taqwa as God consciousness. That I may be aware in every fibre of my being, in all that I do and say and am, that I stand in the presence of God, that I am the creature of God, that God has given me a high dignity, a vocation, a duty, that even though I can't see God, God can see me. This is taqwa. There is something about taqwa which is like that old English saying, the fear of the Lord. Know before whom you stand. In modern Arabic, when they were looking for a word for vaccination, they chose to create a word from the same root as taqwa, something which preserves us from illness or from harm. This is taqwa. Now, there is a story related in the Quran of some desert Arabs who come to the Prophet. And they say, O Messenger of God, we believe. And he responds to them, don't say that you believe, because belief has not yet entered into your heart. Say rather that you have submitted in the way of Islam. Now this gives us a three-part process which is actually confirmed in a discussion between the Prophet and Angel Gabriel. Islam, to submit in the way of God. Iman, that is to believe or to have faith. And Ihsan. Ihsan is to live constantly in the presence of God, knowing that even though you don't see God, God sees you. Now, if we link together taqwa and ihsan, we can see that to live constantly in a state of taqwa is the state of ihsan. To live constantly in the knowledge that we are the creatures of God, given a high vocation, to remember God and be conscious of God in all things. Now, if we were truly doing that, then there would be no room for temptation or for forgetfulness to enter into our lives. Therefore, we would be doing a good act all the time. We can say that living constantly in the state of ihsan is the way of the waliullah, the friends of God, those who are so drawn close to God, so in love with God, that every one of their actions is filled with taqwa, is filled with God consciousness. And this is the closest that any human being can come in this life to the life of paradise. Because in the life of paradise, we will live constantly in this awareness of the presence of God. We have a beautiful model, the Quran tells us. We have a beautiful model for human beings to follow in the person of Prophet Muhammad. We have, in another verse, he is described as a lamp for our steps. And so by looking at his life, by looking at what he says, what he teaches, what he does, one has a beautiful model for a life lived in the state of taqwa, in the state of ihsan. One of the wives of the Prophet describes him as being a living Quran. If you have read the Quran, you see the character of the Prophet. If you see the character of the Prophet, it is as though you have been reading the Quran. And therefore, modeling one's life on him is a principal part of building taqwa in the life of a Muslim. So many examples spring to mind. We have the example of when the Prophet is sitting with his companions and suddenly he stands up. And they say, "What's happening?" And the Prophet points out a funeral procession is going by. And they say, "But that's the funeral of a Jew." And he says, "Yes, I know, stand up, show respect for the one who has died, to respect the humanity of every human being." We have lovely examples of the Prophet mending his own clothes, mending his own sandals. One of his wives tells us that she always knew which was his plate when it came back from the meal, because he would have wiped it so clean that she hardly needed to wash it. So we find in the Prophet a beautiful model, a model of humility. He goes into the mosque, to the assembly, people are seated, are talking. Wherever he goes into an assembly, he just sits down wherever there is a spare place. There's no place reserved for him. There is no golden throne, as it were, a sign of humility. In the same way, we see him being fearless in challenging the ways of the Arabs of his time in ways that are contrary to the traditions and teaching of God. So we know of the case when a young woman comes to him with two men and says, "My father married me to this man without my consent." And the Prophet turned to the father and he said, "Is that true?" And the father said, "Yes, of course it's true. That's what we always do. That's the tradition of our people." And the Prophet responded, "Not anymore, it's not. Not in Islam. A woman must be free to give her own consent in marriage. Marriage dissolved." And then we know that the woman turned around and said to the Prophet, "Please, will you now marry me to this man? Because now it's my decision and not his." And the Prophet married her. So the Prophet is fearless in changing those things in society that are wrong. He also knows how to change the hearts of people. We have a lovely example of the Prophet walking through the marketplace, and every time he came near a certain woman, she would hurl abuse at him. She would throw stones at him. Day after day this happened. One day, there he was, walking through the marketplace, and no woman, no abuse. So he asked his companions, "Where's the woman?" And they said, thank goodness she's sick. She's not here today. And so the prophet responded, I must go to visit her. And when he went to visit her, she was astonished. She said, don't you know who I am? I'm the one who hurls abuse at you every day. And he said, yes, I know who you are. And I heard that you were sick, and I came to visit you. So we have in the prophet a beautiful example. The Islamic tradition speaks of Muhammad as al-insan al-kamil, the perfect human being. He most perfectly embodies all the virtues and all the good qualities, the attributes of goodness that flow from God. He is the embodiment, we can say, of ihsan. I think a helpful model to think of here is if you imagine a polished mirror, and light shines upon that mirror and is reflected. The prophet is like that perfectly polished mirror, and the qualities of God radiate upon the pure polished heart of Muhammad and are then reflected, so that we look at the life of the prophet and we see in his life the qualities of God reflected. So he is like the moon. We know that when we look at night and we see the moon that is shining, it's not shining with its own light. The moon is shining with the reflected light of the sun. If you were to cut off the sun, then the moon would be engulfed in darkness. In the same way, the prophet is like the moon, a beautiful reflector of the light, the qualities of God that are shed upon him so that we may see them reflected from him. Now, we know that the prophet goes on a mysterious journey and ascends into the presence of God. And in the presence of God, he receives knowledge from God. And then he conveys that to his people. He conveys it to that group who gathered around him to be taught the inner way, the way of the Sufi, and he passed on that knowledge, that light, to the imams in the Shia tradition, who would then guide the community in that same path to grow ever closer in the way of God. So we can say that we are growing not just in taqwa, we are growing in our own mihraj, in our own ascension into the presence of God, which we will fully realize in the life hereafter. And these beautiful names that we see reflected in the life of Prophet Muhammad should be reflected in the life of the Muslim too, so that we can see the life of a Muslim, we can see the quality of that life, and we can see then the goodness, the qualities of God reflected there. And just as with the prophet, the inner knowledge is reflected in the outer works. And so we bear the fruits of our faith and our knowledge of God. In our next two series, we're going to be looking at the practical aspects of Islam, and we will see there the way in which they build this spirit of taqwa. Join me again after the break when we're going to do questions and answers, and I'll be responding to some of your questions. Can I remind you that you're very welcome to send in questions by email for the next question and answer session, and you're also very welcome to download an article to go with this talk and each talk from my own website. Can I finally just say that next week we're going to be looking at the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century, to to be looking at the way of life of the Arabs before the time of Islam, to be looking at the political forces that were around at that time, and to be looking at the religious makeup, not just of the Arabian Peninsula itself, but of the surrounding territories too. So please join me after the break for question and answers. Join me next week when we are going to be looking at the 7th century and the Arabian Peninsula. And then we have just 2 more weeks to go before we take a break for Ramadan. And in those 2 weeks, we're going to be looking at what happened after the death of the Prophet from both Sunni and Shia perspectives.